Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Georgia Tech Manufacturing Institute Spring Lunch and Learn series. My name is Ph.D. and I'm the Strategic Partners Officer for GTMI. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, GTMI is one of Georgia Tech's 11 interdisciplinary research institutes. We focus uniquely on manufacturing research, development, and deployment. We help tackle the grand challenges of today's manufacturers and assist our partners in moving their innovations from the lab to the marketplace. GTMI has a wide variety of facilities and equipment located on main campus for basic research and nearby on 14th Street for applied research in our Advanced Manufacturing Pilot Facility, commonly known as AMPF. GTMI's mission includes education and workforce training, collaborative partnerships with industry, academia, and government, and thought leadership. This spring, our Lunch and Learn series are held every Monday at noon as live online events. We welcome Georgia Tech faculty, undergraduate and graduate level students and researchers, as well as our growing global manufacturing community to learn and share advanced manufacturing knowledge through this platform. To ensure a smooth presentation experience, audience members are automatically muted. However, we encourage any audience members who have questions for the speaker to go ahead and submit those questions as they come to mind throughout the presentation using the Q&A panel on your screen. We will then address all of those questions with our speaker at the end of the lecture. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jan Youtie, who will discuss resilient manufacturing and the Georgia Manufacturing Survey from 2020. Jan is Director of the Program in Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy, STIP, in the Enterprise Innovation Institute at Georgia Tech. Her research focuses on technology-based economic development, manufacturing modernization, emerging technology assessment, bibliometric and patent analysis, and innovation and knowledge measurement and evaluation. Sponsors of her work include the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, and at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as the European Commission. Her research has appeared in Research Policy, Scientometrics, and the Journal of Technology Transfer, among others. She has been recognized as one of the top authors in technology and innovation management research by the International Association of Management of Technology. Her recent book, The Strength in Numbers, co-authored with Barry Bozeman and published by Princeton University Press, discusses research authorship decision-making. She holds a doctorate in political science from Emory University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jan Youtie, and you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you to GTMI colleagues. I'm going to share my screen. So probably you're sick of hearing the word resilient for the past year, but resilience in manufacturing, a little similar, but a little different. When we think of resilience in manufacturing, we think of practices that manufacturers can undertake to stay in business or even thrive when faced with challenging events such as the pandemic lockdown. The word resilience in manufacturing has personal meaning to me because when I was growing up, my family business was a manufacturing facility, and we did face a challenge and we had to either sell or go out of business. So having the capability and the wherewithal to be resilient, to stay in business in the face of challenges such as the pandemic lockdown is a special thing to me. So I'm going to talk about the Georgia Manufacturing Survey 2020, which was administered at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown. But I want to remind us what manufacturing was like just prior to the pandemic lockdown, because that's something to consider when thinking about what practices Georgia manufacturers can undertake to be resilient. So we judge manufacturing to have been quite strong prior to the pandemic lockdown. There were more than 10,000 manufacturing establishments This number was consistently growing over the last 6 years prior to the pandemic lockdown. 400,000 employees worked at these establishments. Of course, this number has gone down by 30,000 since the pandemic has occurred. Manufacturing accounted for nearly 11% of the state's economy, which is right at the national average, but gross state product grew by 2.2% in the 2 years prior to the pandemic, and this growth rate was 30% higher than the U.S. average. Also, manufacturing wages were almost twice what retail wages were, suggesting that manufacturing still was an important source for a good middle-income life. Then on the right, I present the start of the pandemic from an inventory which shows the decline in small businesses that took place from over March and April. These are for counts of small businesses overall, and much of the decline occurred in hospitality and entertainment industries, but still overall you've got about a 15% decline in small businesses, and this percentage has doubled since then. So we did have this big drop in the economy and then kind of a little bit of an increase, but still a challenging economic situation. So I am going to switch to telling you a little bit about the Georgia Manufacturing Survey. We've done this survey for decades. And when we first started to think about doing a survey, we looked around at what surveys were available, and we saw a lot of them were from the perspective of economic development. So they asked about what do businesses think of the business climate in Georgia, what are their plans for expansion, which doesn't really have a lot of validity. But no survey was asking about practices that manufacturers were adopting, technologies they were adopting, manufacturing performance. And this would be important information for manufacturing assistance providers, such as our main sponsor of the survey, the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership. So the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership is part of the National Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, or MEP, administered by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to enhance the productivity of small and medium-sized manufacturers. So we do this survey primarily for them, but also for our other partners. And we do it about every 2 to 3 years to be mindful that manufacturers aren't in business to fill out our survey. We deliver this survey through a mixed method. We use a mail questionnaire and we use a website. Most of our respondents to the survey fill out the mail questionnaire. Some of them do fill out the web survey. In past years, we've had about 50 of 500 manufacturers fill out the web survey, but in 2020, we had about 100 manufacturers fill out the web survey because of the pandemic lockdown, most likely. Then we call out the micro enterprises that have 9 or fewer employees, and that left us with 461 manufacturing respondents. Now, we know that there's some response bias, that small manufacturers and manufacturers in resource-based industries don't always fill out the questionnaire to the extent that larger ones do. So we weight our results using the Department of Labor's a quantitative census for employment and wages, QCEW, to reflect these size and industry differences. And just to reiterate, we thank our partners, Georgia Tech, the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership, Kennesaw State University, the Georgia Department of Labor, and the accounting firm Aprio. Our results are all available online on our website that you see here. And this includes a copy of the survey questions, something we call the report of survey, which is breakdown of all the survey questions by industry and size and region, and something we call a brochure report, which is kind of a designed executive report that's easier to read and shorter. So let's get started. I'm designing this talk around 5 insights from the survey, which we think are most applicable to the concept of manufacturing resilience. These are, first, the money, financial management. Second, the technology systems. Third, the ability to be responsive in offerings, processes, supply chains. Fourth, the workforce. And fifth, the external connections. So let's start with the money. One thing I want to reiterate again is Georgia manufacturers were strong before the pandemic started, and we really see that reflected in the survey results. 95% of Georgia manufacturers that responded to our survey had positive sales growth. This is up from 89% in the previous survey. And 95% of Georgia manufacturers were thus profitable. In this chart here, I'm showing facility employment size along the horizontal axis and median sales growth per employee along the y-axis. And you can see that small and medium-sized facilities had about the same median sales growth per employee, around $3,000 sales growth per employee. Large manufacturers had more than $5,000 per employee. So they really benefited from this financial upswing in manufacturing over the last 2 years. And as a result, they have stronger financial management systems, which can really help them now that we're in a downturn. So because manufacturers were in this strong financial situation in part, many of them did not use external grant or loan programs or tax credits. So on the left, I show a bar chart where the y-axis is loan or grant offerings, and the x-axis is the percent of Georgia manufacturers that use these offerings. And you can see that about 30% of manufacturers took out a bank loan. Then it drops to 10% using personal savings, and only 1% use government programs such as the Small Business Innovation Research, SBIR program. So the majority of manufacturers did not use these external financial programs, do not have the experience with these financial programs. Then on the right-hand side, we see a bar chart that shows on the horizontal axis the percent of manufacturers using tax credit options, and on the vertical axis, various tax credit options. So research and development tax credits only used by 14% of manufacturers. Investment tax credits, only 14%. Job credit tax credits, for 13%. And then you get down around 5% when you look at retraining tax credits, energy tax credits, import-export credits. So most manufacturers do not take these tax credits, even though the pool of eligibility for them is much higher. So let's take, for instance, the research and development tax credit. 30% of Georgia manufacturers do research and development, but only 14% take the tax credit. So there are a number of reasons why this could be the case. Sometimes manufacturers fear they might get audited. Sometimes they just don't want to fill out the forms. But whatever the reason, we're kind of in a period now where we really need more financial resources for our economy and for manufacturing. So manufacturers that have capabilities to use these instrument and tax credits, this is the time where they can benefit. So that's the first insight. Let's move to the second insight, which is about technology systems used by manufacturers. So we see that almost 90% of Georgia manufacturers use one digital technology. I'm surprised it's not 100%, but I understand that many small manufacturers still use paper systems. But in any case, most manufacturers use at least one digital technology. And if they use one digital technology, that technology is either enterprise resource planning, used by almost 70% of Georgia manufacturers, or computer-aided design, used by 65% of Georgia manufacturers. So these technologies have been around for quite a while. Then the percentage drops precipitously to 30% for barcode readers, supply chain management software, and sensors. And then you get down toward the bottom of the list, cobots, additive manufacturing, augmented reality. Fewer than 10% of Georgia manufacturers use technologies. I should say the technologies are on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the percentage of survey respondents using these technologies. The blue segment of the bar represents those who have used these technologies, and the lighter segment represents plans to use these technologies. So if we look at plans, the plans are highest for barcode readers at 20% and digital dashboards and RFID at 17%. These plans are kind of a little lower than they were in the 2018 survey, and it's not clear that manufacturers who say they have plans for adopting these technologies actually do end up having these technologies implemented in their facility. One thing I want to note about these technologies is they're more likely to be adopted by larger facilities with 250 or more employees than for smaller facilities. This is particularly true of the kinds of technologies that address scale issues, such as barcode readers, supply chain management, sensors, robots. Also, most of these technologies are shop floor technologies that aren't connected to the internet. But some of these technologies are at the management level, and they are connected to the internet. These are like supply chain management and cloud manufacturing, for example. So once the facility is connected to the internet, it has to address security issues. How are manufacturers doing this? We've kind of experimented over the years with various ways to ask about what manufacturers are doing to secure their IT systems. And we've come upon what we think is a good approach for assessing this, which is to ask them whether they have currently adopted data security compliance standards. when we ask about this, we find that fewer than a quarter of Georgia manufacturers have adopted data security compliance standards. So we asked about particular standards. These are on the horizontal axis, and the percent of respondents that say they have adopted these standards in their facility are on the y-axis. The most commonly adopted standard is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, used by the European Union. That's 21% of manufacturers. Then the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, 7% of Georgia manufacturers use this standard. 3% of Georgia manufacturers use ISO 27001, and then 9% use an agglomeration of other standards, some of which are real data security compliance standards, such as from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, but some of them reflect the confusion that manufacturers have about data security when they respond with things like firewalls or passwords. Those are not data security compliance standards. They don't really protect against privacy and security. So when we look at data security compliance, we see that large manufacturers are most likely to have implemented data security compliance standards, but we find that there's a difference by industry, that companies in the automotive industry more likely to have these standards, and those that have an international supply chain or are in an international supply chain are more likely to have these standards because of requirements like the GDPR. So secure IT systems is something that we'll be keeping an eye on in the future. This is really an area of important growth for Georgia manufacturers. Next, we're going to switch to the notion of responsiveness in production. How responsive are Georgia manufacturers to changes in the market? One way to measure this is to look at products and processes. To what extent have Georgia manufacturers adopted new products or new or improved processes? New products tend to be more common than new processes. So I'm showing new products on the left of the chart as you look at it with the blue bars. 46% of Georgia manufacturers have adopted new products. New product adoption increases almost monotonically by facility employment size, such that almost 70% of Georgia manufacturers with 250 or more employees have adopted a new product. Also, food, textile, electronics, and science-based industries, where science-based industries include medical device industries, pharmaceuticals. More than half of those firms have adopted a new product. But when you look at new processes, that the percentage of manufacturers that have introduced new processes is around 30% overall. It's about the same for small and medium-sized manufacturers, but for manufacturers with 250 or more employees, it's more like 50%, just over 50%. And if you look by industry, the electronics transportation industry, 50% of those have introduced new processes. So new product and new process introduction capabilities do exist in the Georgia manufacturing base, but new products are a lot more common than new processes. Presumably the new products didn't require new processes the way that some of the new processes, new products for the larger companies may have required new processes. So another way to look at responsiveness in production is to look at how Georgia manufacturers responded to some analogous changes. One analogous change is the introduction of trade and tariff policies, which took place over the previous 4 years, led by the previous administration. So how did manufacturers respond when trade and tariffs increased? So 34% didn't do anything except increase prices to customers. 16% of respondents switched from foreign to US-based suppliers. So they brought their supply chain more in-house in the domestic market. 11% stockpiled inventory. So this is kind of against the lean manufacturing model, but they stockpiled the inventory because of uncertainty. It was a strategic decision. And then 9% switched to non-US based suppliers. So these changes didn't differ too much among small and medium-sized facilities, but they did differ among larger facilities. Larger facilities, if you look at those, 44% increased prices to customers and 33% switched to US-based suppliers. Also, the automotive supply chain was distinctive in how it responded to trade and tariff policies. 41% increased prices to customers, 22% switched to US-based suppliers, and even 18% stockpiled inventory. So there is some responsiveness in the Georgia manufacturing sector with respect to major policy changes that can give us some clues as to how manufacturers may respond to pandemic lockdown changes. And a third way we can think about how Georgia manufacturers might respond to the pandemic is to think about what manufacturers might be at risk from disruptions. And if we assume that disruptions are most prominent in international supply chains and sales chains, then we can make some assumptions to estimate what percent of manufacturers might be at risk from disruptions. So we've looked at the distributions of various variables such as export sales, percent of manufacturers' purchases of parts, materials and services, percent of purchases of imports, finished goods, and we can see the lower parts of the distribution in the second column of the chart, the middle parts of the distribution in the third column of the chart, and the top of the distribution in the last column of the chart. And if we just take the top of the distribution, 11% or more exports or imports, then we can see that 14% of Georgia manufacturers get 11% or more of their exports from internationally. So that's of their sales internationally. So that could potentially put them at risk. 26% of Georgia manufacturers' purchases of materials, parts, or services come internationally. a substantial portion of those come internationally, and 10% of Georgia manufacturers get their finished goods, a substantial part of their finished goods internationally, and then 11% of Georgia manufacturers outsource production. Of course, there's some overlap in these percentages, but if we take them all together, they suggest that 1/4 of Georgia manufacturers may be at risk from disruptions from the pandemic lockdown to an international supply chain. Of course, you can have disruptions to a domestic supply chain too, as we've seen with the weather-related disruptions and the Texas energy disruptions to the distribution of the vaccine. But in any case, this is one way to look at the percent of manufacturers that might be at risk. Next, we'll focus on workforce issues. So we have asked since the beginning of the survey, where do manufacturers have their greatest problems or needs? And manufacturers can indicate more than one area. Most of our survey respondents do indicate two areas at least. And then we compare across the years, and we see in 2020 there are some differences relative to the previous year. The first difference has to do with the emphasis on workforce. 37% of Georgia manufacturers have a problem or need related to technical skills. 31% have a problem or need related to marketing. But look, even 29% of Georgia manufacturers need more workers with just basic workforce skills such as reading, writing, Then there's a less of an emphasis on lean manufacturing, not much change until you get to the bottom of the table. Energy costs, there's less emphasis on energy costs because of the decline of energy prices and a little bit of a bump in cybersecurity issues. It's still a low percentage, so we'll see where that goes, but it's something to pay attention to. So in any case, most manufacturers say they have workforce needs even just prior to the pandemic. I'm sure it's much worse now. So let's talk about some of these issues that are pandemic potentially related. So the first is training. If manufacturers say they need more workers with technical skills, are they offering training to their manufacturers up these technical skills? Well, the answer is not really. 45% of Georgia manufacturers offered no external training. Another 32% only offered external training to a handful of employees, 10% or fewer. The likelihood of workforce training is higher for large manufacturers, and in general, there's not much training that occurs. The second workforce area is absenteeism. Absenteeism is exacerbated by the pandemic lockdown. Manufacturers have to figure out new ways to manage their factory in the face of absenteeism, social distancing, those kinds of issues. And team-based approaches could potentially help, especially if team members are cross-trained. But we see the use of teams is not where it could be. 43% of manufacturers do not use teams anywhere in the facility. Team use is smallest for small manufacturers with 10 to 49 employees, and it's highest for manufacturers with 250 or more employees. More than half of those use teams. Of course, a very small manufacturer with only a few employees might presumably be less likely to use Teams, but still having this kind of backup is critical for absenteeism-related issues coming out of the pandemic. Also, we see that industries in the electronics and transportation area are more likely to use Teams. So these are things to keep in mind as workforce management issues arise with absenteeism related to the pandemic. Finally, the last insight has to do with external connections. So isolation is always a challenge for manufacturers because they don't get to learn what other manufacturers are doing, what are the best practices, but it's particularly challenging during a pandemic when you can't just walk next door, have group events to learn what your colleagues in other businesses are doing. So external assistance providers can help bridge this gap to knowledge sharing, but they are not much used run up to the pandemic. This is the percent. This chart represents the percent of Georgia manufacturers that used external business sources in the 2 years prior to the pandemic, and you can see the big bar at the bottom of the chart. 57% of Georgia manufacturers use no external sources. Then if you look at what sources were used, 20% of manufacturers use Georgia Tech. There might be some bias in that we're delivering the survey from Georgia Tech and we're asking about use of Georgia Tech, but actually the survey is mailed out through the Georgia Department of Labor, so it gives us some protection from that kind of bias. So 20% report using Georgia Tech, 16% use the private sector, a CPA, an attorney, a consulting firm, 10% use the Georgia Department of Labor, 9% use technical college. So there's no one dominant service provider. You kind of need a mix to deal with the diverse needs of manufacturers, but it's really important to think about how to make connections with these 57% that aren't assisted. So who are these companies that aren't assisted? They tend to be smaller. You can see the majority of the facilities with 10 to 49 employees did not use an external assistance provider, whereas there's not much difference between the facilities with 50 to 249 and 250 facility employees. More than 60% of those used an external assistance provider. Also, there's not much difference by industry group except for the material, like pulp and paper, those kinds of industries. Okay, so just wrapping up, careful financial management. We know that manufacturers came off of several years of steady growth. Some of them spent their money as they made it. Some of them carefully managed their financial situation. The latter needs to be brought forth during the pandemic lockdown. Tax credits and financial support measures can be useful here and really should be considered in these unusual circumstances where appropriate. Second, IT systems. Nearly all the manufacturers use at least one IT technology. Some of them are connected to the internet, especially management level technologies such as supply chain management and cloud manufacturing, but only 24% of the Georgia manufacturers use proven data security compliance systems, particularly larger companies. So a good target would be to help smaller facilities to extent it's relevant and industries outside of automotive supply chain. We think the pandemic is likely to increase interest in and need for these kinds of data security compliance standards. So this is something to monitor going forward. The extent of responsiveness in business offerings. Can manufacturers pivot, if you will, to offer new products and change their processes to support these new product offerings? Well, 30% of Georgia manufacturing have done that, but small facilities are less likely to have upgraded their processes to offer new products. Also, through our kind of emphasis on looking at who's likely to be at risk from an international supply chain disruption, about 34% of Georgia manufacturers seem to be at risk, although we acknowledge that even domestic supply chain disruptions can occur. So these kinds of decisions about what to do with the supply chain, we're expecting more need for strategic assessments to support these kinds of decisions as a result of the pandemic. So then workforce backup. We found that just over 40% of all manufacturers offered no external training, but this percentage was even higher for small manufacturers, with 60% offering no external training. Fewer than half of the small facilities and those in the materials and machinery industries use teams, but teams could be very helpful with high periods of absenteeism for cross-training and backup. Finally, external connections. We think interfirm connectivity is very important for understanding what are the best practices in manufacturing or just what other manufacturers are doing. But it's very difficult to connect with other manufacturers during a pandemic lockdown. These barriers can be reduced through using external assistance sources, but use of external assistance sources is only by the minority of manufacturers, and particularly among smaller manufacturers, nearly 70% of those do not use an external business source. But we expect that new best practices will emerge from the pandemic lockdown, and it's important to become aware of these to prepare for the next upward cycle in manufacturing, which we're sure will occur. So with that, I close by showing the websites for the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership and also for the Georgia Manufacturing Survey. And I invite you to ask questions. I think we've got about a little over 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and look for your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Youtie. That was very interesting. A lot of insights into what's been happening in manufacturing over the past year as we try to navigate this pandemic or leading up to it. It looks like we have a couple of questions submitted from audience members thus far, and as Jan suggested, any other audience members out there with questions, please go ahead and submit those through the Q&A panel on your screen. So Dr. Youtie, I'll read the first couple questions we've received. The first is from Russ, and the question is, how many manufacturers took advantage of PPP loans?
So I don't know, because we didn't really break down the sources by type of loan. In general, most manufacturers don't take advantage of loans or other resources such as tax credits. One reason is they tend not to be able to just fill out this paperwork. They might not have the backing, the collateral for loans. It's complicated to get a loan. Some of them just don't want to have that on their books. For tax credits, they're concerned about audits. So all these kinds of issues face programs that want to provide funding for manufacturers. It's a challenge to provide financial resources for manufacturers. The large manufacturers do it. The small and medium-sized ones typically don't do it.
Thank you, Jan. And the next question is related to cybersecurity technology adoption. This participant commented that the level of cybersecurity technology adoption by Georgia manufacturers is low. What are the major barriers, technical know-how, financial cost, et cetera, that might be contributing?
That's a good question. So the first issue is many manufacturing facilities aren't fully automated. Some of them still use paper-based systems. They're not always reflected in our survey. We didn't see that the percentage of manufacturers with at least one information technology was 100%. It was 87%. So some do not use information technology. The second is some of this technology is not connected to the internet. Some of it is just on the shop floor. So these manufacturers don't think about broadly internet-related security issues. They're just thinking about keeping their equipment going. But some at the manufacturing level, such as cloud manufacturing, supply chain management software, those kinds of technologies are connected to the internet, and I think the others will increasingly be connected to the internet. So I think there's issues at the demand side. There's kind of a low demand right now. Then to your solution, to your factors that you raised, technical know-how, yes, I do think there's a technical know-how challenge. 37% of manufacturers said they don't have the technical skills in their workforce, and 43% do not offer external training, or 45%. So manufacturers do lack technical know-how. Then financial costs. I'm not sure what the cost of some of these solutions are. There are a number of ways to deal with them. One is through the use of external assistance sources, but some manufacturers use external assistance sources, some do not. Some do not because they're kind of keep their heads down and just try to get their product out. Some of them don't use external sources because they're lifestyle companies and they're not interested in that kind of improvement. So all these factors kind of come together. It's a demand side problem and a supply side problem.
Thank you. That makes sense. So we have another question from Aaron. This question is, the website shows the survey itself, but not the data. Is there a place to access and view the data?
We don't put the data on the website because we kind of want to keep control over the data. We do have breakdowns of the results for each question, so you can see kind of detailed responses. There is the possibility of a public data set that can be made available to someone who's interested, but we don't have the resources to provide ongoing support for this public data set. So basically, we give the data to selected people who can be validated, and they're kind of on their own.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So those are all of the questions that I see at this time. I believe we may be able to wrap up a little bit early, but I want to thank Dr. Youtie for your time today, and I want to thank all of our attendees who have logged in, and hopefully you will be able to walk away with some new insights into the manufacturing community in Georgia. And I know I personally found it very informative and interesting. And I also invite our attendees to log in next Monday at noon. Our featured speaker will be Dr. Senthil Kumar from the National University of Singapore. He will present ultra-precision machining of optical surfaces. In addition, today's lecture has been recorded and will be posted on the Georgia Tech Manufacturing Institute website for your future reference. Or if there are colleagues or friends of yours who are unable to attend, please invite them to visit our website in the next couple of days, and they should be able to access the recording in that way. And the URL for our website is research.gotech.edu/manufacturing, and you can check the events tab for all of our past and upcoming lectures. Thank you again, Dr. Youtie, and thank you to our audience. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.